Have you ever wondered why Canadians say sorry so much? Never thought about it much until I had American friends who came up and said, do you realize how much you guys say sorry? Sorry, sorry. I was thinking, I made a list of things that we say sorry about after reading Reddit and just thinking it through. I'm like, oh yeah, this is true. You say sorry when asking a waiter for extra napkins. You say, sorry, is this table free? You say sorry when you come to work late. And you say sorry if you arrive at work too early. The craziest thing that other people from other cultures have noted about Canadians is that we don't just say sorry when we bump into other people, but we actually say sorry when they bump into us as well. It's an instinct. You didn't even do anything wrong, but the first thing that you think of doing as a Canadian is to say sorry. Why is this? It's actually a very complex thing. Psychologists have spilled a lot of ink writing on this as well as authors. And here's my thinking on it. I think that the reason that we say sorry so much as Canadians is that the word for us is not so much of an apology, but rather a reflexive word that communicates a certain unspoken thought. I think this is what we're saying. As a Canadian, I live in a society that prizes peace and harmony. My reflexive utterance of sorry is my personal acknowledgement that this situation, not saying it's anyone's fault, has disrupted that peace. Sorry is my instinctive way of communicating that I have no intention of furthering this uncomfortable situation and will do everything in my power to restore the peace. I think that's actually what Canadians are saying. It's just too long to say, so we just say sorry. And I think this is essentially what I call the Canadian gospel. The highest good in our society is peace. That is a lack of conflict, not impinging on anyone else's life whatsoever. Now, it's good to have a society that strives for peace. I much prefer that than a society that strives for war. But what if the truth requires you to say something that disrupts the peace? Like telling someone that the way that they're living is wrong. In Canada, that is a sin. Because as Canadians, we've been culturally conditioned to believe that what is ultimately important is not truth, but a lack of conflict. That is the highest Canadian ideal and value. And if truth needs to be sacrificed on the altar of peace, so be it. And that is why we instinctively say sorry when it's not even our fault. And that's why why in Canada, when you try to share with people about God, judgment, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, people get very, very uncomfortable. And they'll say stuff like, oh, it's fine that you believe that, but I don't think you should be sharing stuff like that and making other people think about this as well. Why? Because you're violating Canada's highest value. The truth does not matter. What matters is what works for you. And if a person feels that they're happy, it is sinful for you to try to disrupt that or to dissuade them otherwise. See, friends, just so you understand, the Canadian gospel of peace at the expense of biblical truth is the broad way to destruction that leads to hell. Canadians may not believe in a biblical definition of sin, but we certainly believe there are cultural sins, and we are quick to pounce on those who commit them, especially Christians. See, as Christians, we do need to free ourselves from the Canadian gospel and practice Christ's gospel. See, our ultimate goal is not to please the popular culture. All God's faithful have been persecuted. Noah, herald of righteousness, was mocked for building his ark, of course, until the flood came. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into a fiery furnace for refusing to bow to the idol. They could have just said sorry, and it would all have been better. 2 Chronicles 24, righteous Zechariah was stoned by the king Joash's men for calling out disobedience to God's law. See, most of history, you realize that speaking out against religious leaders or political leaders would cost you your life And yet, Christians, God's faithful, have always said, we must obey God rather than men. You know, let me go back to John for a bit here. This type of thinking is what ended up John being in jail. You know, John was most likely imprisoned at Herod's fortress called Machaerus in Perea, which is modern-day Jordan. And you can still go there today. It's a ruin now, but it stands on top of a hill overlooking the beautiful Dead Sea. And it contains, according to archaeology, a palace, rooms, a courtyard, and a dungeon, and so on. Matthew doesn't tell us this, but Mark 6:20 says, Herod feared John, knowing he was a righteous man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. You know, this is astounding. Herod disliked John's preaching. He disliked what he had to say. He disliked the fact that John's gospel, or the truth that he taught, did not accord with his worldview. He knew he was a holy man. He couldn't allow him to continue preaching lest it destabilize him politically. And he also couldn't kill him because he was afraid of risking divine judgment. The text seems here to imply that after locking up John, because that was the only thing he can do, though he hated his message, he was intrigued by the man. And though he was in prison, he talked with him. John's teaching, it says, was perplexing to him, and yet he heard it gladly. This sounds very much like another story in the book of Acts of Governor Felix talking with the Apostle Paul when he had him there in jail, regularly conversing with him and asking about the faith. You know, I find it a very strange and interesting phenomenon as well, that non-Christians regularly come to hear me preach. Not just me, others too. And although they may not always find what I have to say agreeable to them, and they find it perplexing, they still take pleasure in hearing and are curious, just as King Herod was, even if they don't commit. You know, I'm certain that John was not an unruly prisoner. He was probably an excellent man, strong and truthful. In contrast, Herod was a weak man who was pragmatic and unable to kill John because of the crowds. But nevertheless, the truth of God fascinated him.